The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anush Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. I've got a very important story on today's show. The podcast has obviously been quite industry focused as a theme over the last couple of years. I've spoken to many entrepreneurs, investors and scientists, but I think it's really important to remember the human stories behind all this excitement about the plant. A lot of the guests I've spoken to have a very personal drive as to why they want to be in the cannabis industry, and unfortunately it's often related to illness. So by listening to the stories of the patients, we can really understand the amazing potential cannabis has to alleviate suffering and why that's so important. I had the great pleasure of speaking to Michelle Kendall, who has terminal ovarian cancer and has been a very vocal advocate for medical cannabis. In fact, she's produced a documentary about it called Schedule 1. It's a really important and brave story to know, as she's shown such determination in her fight. I really hope that you enjoy the episode, and I'd be grateful if you please check out the documentary too. Cheers. On today's show, I have Michelle Kendall. Michelle has terminal ovarian cancer and has been using cannabis to treat her cancer. But she's also produced a documentary about her journey called Schedule 1, which was released a few months ago. Michelle, welcome.
Hi, Anuj. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my story.
Real pleasure. And we've been chatting for a while over email, and I had a great privilege of watching Schedule 1 with my wife. And as I said to you before, it moved me to tears, moved both of us to tears. So I'm really glad I can get you on to talk about your experience and the film.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Great. Cool. Okay, well, look, let's start at the beginning. Maybe tell us a bit about your diagnosis and when and how that happened.
Sure. We had just moved to Oxford. My husband is a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and there was a few weeks we lived in Switzerland on the way while he was doing research in Zurich, and I started to feel symptoms. And I tell this part of the story because the symptoms of ovarian cancer are so vague that I want to use every opportunity to, share those symptoms. So I started having some bowel issues, sort of swings in both extremes. And then I had the very odd feeling of not being as hungry. And I love my food. So that was very distinctive. And I just couldn't eat big meals, even though I didn't feel full. And when we went to Oxford and got established with the healthcare system there, and I went and told them that I thought maybe I had giardia from doing a big hike in the Swiss Alps while we were there, and several visits to the GP. And unfortunately, it took a good 5 months to be diagnosed. And that's very typical with ovarian cancer because the organ is so deep and the symptoms can be so easily misunderstood for GI issues. So I just encourage all women that if something doesn't feel right for more than a few weeks, to really go get that checked out. So unfortunately, when I finally was diagnosed and had surgery, it was stage 3C, which is where most women are diagnosed at that stage. And that means that it's spread throughout the abdomen. And some women can escape recurrence at stage 3, but not very many. So they took out lots of parts of my body I didn't even know I had. Both ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, cervix, and my appendix. I almost had to have a big chunk of my bowel removed, but thankfully I escaped that. The peritoneal lining of the abdomen, basically they sort of peel off the whole lining of the abdomen and try to bundle it up to get as many of the cancer cells out as they can. Then also a portion of my diaphragm. So there's a little gully that ovarian cancer tends to sort of make a run for, and that's where it spreads to, called the Morrison's pouch, which I'd never heard of before surgery. Right. So they dug around in there and took out a little bit of my diaphragm. So it was a very big surgery, 54 staples in the hospital for 9 or 10 days at Churchill. And then I started on the chemo, a very standard regimen of carboplatin and Taxol. and had a great response. Most ovarian cancers respond very well to chemo, but it just tends to come back because of the stem cells which drive the recurrence. So I had 14 months of a wonderful remission where I felt very well. And then it came back with a vengeance, as is typical. And then I had the second series of the same couplet of carbo and Taxol, which is standard. Some women are now getting PARB inhibitors sooner in their course of treatment than I did, but those are relatively new. The second chemo was definitely harder, and then I had a year-long remission from that. And at that point, we knew that it was terminal. As soon as I had a recurrence, the standard treatment doesn't have any curative options. So that's when I started. Well, that's when I knew that I was terminal. So that was the basic course. And then I've had one more course since then. So I've had 3 recurrences in 5 years, but everything really changed from cannabis. So I hope that the last 2 years I'm veering off of the traditional course of treatment, and hopefully we're going to make a miracle happen here.
Well, yeah, I mean, before we get into that, and it's thank you for being so candid and explaining that, what you went through. At that point, prior to getting involved with any kind of cannabis as a treatment, what were the treatments the doctors were giving you, and how did they kind of describe the next stage once they'd sort of given you the terminal diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, basically that there are some more options for chemo, but that it just delays the inevitable. And with ovarian, the recurrences tend to become more quickly. The remission periods shorten, and definitely the chemo is much harder. The third series of chemo I had, they substituted the Taxol because of the toxic effects to the nerves, and they substituted that with doxorubicin, which is in cancer circles nicknamed the Red Devil. And it was awful for me. I had never had nausea for the first 2 series of chemo, and I never felt great, but I never felt, terrible. And I thought, oh, these people are, exaggerating. And of course, I'm much younger than the average cancer patient, and I know that helps, but the Doxol was really awful. And I had intractable nausea, even, with lots of anti-nausea meds during my infusion for 5-6 days after. And I would have to go for an infusion of IV fluids because I couldn't even keep liquids down. So it was much harder. And basically they just try to, because recurrent ovarian cancer can often be really responsive to chemo. Some women are living through 6 cycles of chemotherapy, a series of chemotherapy. I mean, 6-month-long periods. I don't mean one infusion. So it responds, but it gets shorter and shorter. And so, I never asked my oncologist, like, when do you think my expiration date is? But I'm a very sciencey person, and I've read the literature. And so I've seen the progression-free survival charts. And usually by 5 years, women with ovarian cancer have all died.
Right.
And those numbers are eaching out a little bit, but, all with great, great cost to quality of life.
Yeah.
And I should back up a sec. I want to make sure I explain I'm BRCA negative, which is a gene mutation that's associated with breast cancer and some ovarian cancers. And so some of the new PARB inhibitors are working much better for women with BRCA, but they're not, they are offering them to women like me, but it only offers about 3 or 4 months longer of progression-free survival. So, 3 months is, I want more than that.
Yeah.
I want 3 decades.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed. So where are you now in the, when you said 5 years, where are you at this current point?
Yeah, so my first symptoms were 5 years ago in August, and my diagnosis was in February. So I'm coming up on 5 years.
Right.
So I did have a second surgery, and that was laparoscopic, thank goodness, much easier to recover from. And that surgery, at that point, had already been on the cannabis, but the huge fall in my tumor marker had just happened, and I didn't have time to really decide. It was all just happening right before surgery, so I went ahead with it, which I'm glad I did. They got as much disease out as they could, and because it was easy to recover from, I'm glad I did that.
Yeah.
But some women don't even make it to second surgery. So for that, they took out my gallbladder and tumors around my pancreas. There was definitely an option for them to take the pancreas, which I was desperate to keep because, of course, then I would have been a diabetic, and that makes life so much more difficult. So I was thrilled to wake up with my pancreas still. So that's where ovarian cancer tends to spread. It tends to come up, and it's right there behind my sternum. But as of right now, I have no evidence of disease. My cancer antigen marker, CA125, which is the marker that once you have ovarian cancer, is a pretty good indication of the state of disease. It's not, each tumor type makes a different level of what they're testing in the CA125 blood test. So it's not a good diagnostic. But once you have disease, you can use it to track the progression and how big the tumor is. So I have no evidence of disease as far as the tumor marker is showing, and I will be eligible for a scan coming up here at my 1-year anniversary. So November 19th will be 1 year since my last chemo. And the fact that I am still in single digits, any oncologist who looks at my history would say is remarkable and absolutely statistically unexpected.
Wow. And so presumably you attribute that to the introduction of medical cannabis into your regimen.
Absolutely.
And so would you mind taking us through the process of how you came to get involved in that?
Sure. When you have terminal cancer, I think many people end up in sort of, crazy, desperate corners of the internet. And I had no exposure to cannabis until 2.5 years ago. I live in California, and I'd certainly known people who mentioned taking it, but I had no interest. I had never seen cannabis all growing up, never hung out at parties where it was consumed. But I kept reading on the internet, cannabis has helped me, cannabis has helped me, and then about shrinking tumors. And I thought, how can this be real? As someone who comes from a family of a lot of doctors and academics, I just thought, I just don't believe this. And this was all in like chat rooms on Facebook and, But then I saw Dr. Mieri's talk at Harvard at the first CanMed conference. And after I saw that talk, my jaw hit the floor. And I got myself into PubMed, which I was familiar with, and read and read and read. And yes, the science is very complicated, but then I knew it was real. And yes, it's complicated and it's not a magic cure-all, but I thought there's something here and I'm just ahead of my time. So I started very tentatively, initially with 2.5 milligrams, and I was scared to death to take it, which now in hindsight, I didn't even feel anything. So I started that very tentatively 2.5 years ago. And we had a summer planned of lots of travel because I've cashed out all my retirement and wanted to make some wonderful memories with my husband. So we had 4 big international trips that summer. So I had taken a tiny bit, but wasn't able to take a lot because of the travel. So 2 years ago, this September, I started in on about 10 or 15 milligrams that the neighbor made for me, who is a retired general practitioner. And he said, Michelle, I'll give you some chocolates. And that was about 9 months after my chemo. And my number had just started inching up at the end of all that travel, which is what I expected. And that's why we had gone big with all the trips. So it went up 3 points, 1 3-week period. Then I had another 3-week period. Those were in between the infusions of the maintenance therapy, Avastin. And then as soon as I started taking the cannabis, the very first 3-week period, it only went up 1 point.
Wow.
And I thought, holy cow, this might be real. And so I stayed on that for the fall 2 years ago, and a very small dose, only at night. And it was only going up 1 point every 3 weeks. And that was so distinctively different from the recurrence beforehand, where once it started growing, it shot up to 90 points in just 6 weeks.
Wow.
And Dr. Sekon was even very surprised when I had that blood work. I think it's quite an aggressive tumor. So I thought, this is real. So I went off the cannabis for our trip to the Galapagos at the winter holiday coming up on 2 years. And it shot up 8 points in those 3-week periods off the cannabis.
Right.
And that's when I said, okay, I have to take this seriously. My life depends on this. This is real. My tumor responds, and I need to figure this out. So I just read and read and read some more and tried to do the best I could with, DIY oncology, which is ridiculous. And the high CBD doesn't seem to influence my tumor. I was up to about 350 milligrams a day, and it slowed the tumor growth a tiny bit. But then, so since I'm a very sciencey oriented person, I was changing my dosage during each 3-week period, trying to get a sense of what it was doing. And I was having the blood work every 3 weeks with my Avastin infusions. And for people who aren't aware, Avastin doesn't shrink tumors. It supposedly slows them down by limiting the blood supply. So it's just trying to limit the body's ability to make new blood vessels, which the cancer needs to grow. And you can only be on Avastin for a few years because you need blood vessels.
Yeah.
So every 3 weeks, I changed the formula. And when I went on to the high THC dose, it fell like a rock, 50% in a 5-week period. And that was right before I was scheduled for surgery.
Wow.
So I had the surgery, and then I decided to go ahead with the 3rd series of chemo. And I took a little bit of cannabis during that time. But I just thought, okay, when I'm done with this series of chemo, this is the only thing I have left is cannabis. So I took a little bit during that 6-month series of chemo, but it was a very difficult with the Doxo, the Red Devil. And then I've been on approximately 30 to 50 milligrams of cannabis a day since then. And sometimes I try to be very regimented, but sometimes I just think, well, I'll take what I feel like I can take today. If I have a lot to do, I take less. The pandemic has made it very convenient to take a lot because no one's going anywhere. So I'm trying to figure out which compounds are doing the work. It's different mutations drive different types of cancer. And so the other thing I want to make sure that I explain is that my mutation, since I'm not BRCA, the only mutation I really have is the P53 mutation, which is really ubiquitous in most cancers. And they call that gene the sort of protects the genome. And it's the gene or one of the genes that is a tumor suppressor gene. And if you have a P53 mutation, your body doesn't sort of recognize when the cells are misbehaving. And it's very common across many kinds of cancer. And that's why I'm so hopeful that many, many types of cancer can be helped, because the cannabis is helping my body somehow trigger the apoptosis and working to do the job that the P53 sort of isn't doing.
And apoptosis is the cells killing themselves, is that right?
Right. So your body is great at recycling itself. And when cells die, and cells like in the lining of your intestine, they grow and die very quickly. And so when the cells are done with their useful life, they, disintegrate in an orderly way. And that's the body's way of getting rid of the waste product. And so apoptosis is a natural process that our bodies are doing all the time in every cell that's and reached the end of its life. And so the cannabis is triggering apoptosis in the cancer cells and doesn't seem to be hurting the rest of the cells in the body.
Yeah.
And there's actually multiple different effects. It also helps with decreasing the ability of the cancer cells to migrate. And so, it's working in many different ways. There's many different modes of action.
Yeah. Wow. There's loads there I want to go into. Well, one of the things, if I can, was just around the CBD, THC aspects. What exactly are you taking? Are you taking just pure oils and mixing them to a ratio, or you? So
I take sublingual tinctures that are made for me, and I'm so grateful that we have a compassion program in California, and I very rarely buy any meds. They're donated to me, and lots of growers that are cheering me on and so supportive, and I feel so lucky. And when I get emails from people in the UK, I get emails from people all over the world, but it breaks my heart that they're struggling to access this. And I've never had an access problem because I live in Santa Barbara County and we have a thriving grower community. So I take sublingual oils mostly. They tend to make me very sleepy because they're made from an indica type plant. So then sometimes I take sort of more, upper type strains in the morning and during the day. And I'll take like a gummy that I can put under my tongue. And then sometimes I've actually tried doing a lotion all over my stomach. I know that it goes through the skin, and I've put it on my feet, and it has really helped with the pain, the neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy that many cancer patients get when they've had a lot of Taxol. And I've done that, and can feel it doing things. So I thought, why not? So for a few weeks, I was just rubbing loads of it all over my abdomen to see if it would, soak in through my stomach. So, I wish I could give myself blood work all the time, and, I'm happy to be a guinea pig. I want to push the science forward.
And are they whole plant extracts?
Yeah, so I am on a whole plant extract of THC, and then I have a dosing physician, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, who many people are familiar with from her activism, and that she's really at the forefront of cancer and cannabis in Los Angeles. So she has helped me, but she's really just guessing too. I mean, she's got a bit more of an educated guess than I do, but it's also that each tumor is so different. So I've certainly used what she's taught me, and sometimes I think I still know nothing. So she also had me on CBG, CBDA, CBD, and THCA. So the full complement of that. So, sometimes I dose 3 times a day, sometimes just at night. We just don't know enough.
Yeah.
We just don't know enough.
And one of the things that we talked about just before we started recording was that sometimes the THC can be a bit too much. You feel a bit too groggy, and it's, it's sort of impairing you to a level that's not very comfortable.
Yeah, I've never felt bad. I've never felt worried that I'm losing my mind or going crazy. I mean, I've never seen things that aren't there. I've never heard things. I've never felt paranoid. It's just a very foggy feeling. And I mean, if I had to do that for the rest of my life, of course I would, because I have good days and I can easily go off for a day. But it would be lovely if it was a bit more precise, for sure. And I know we'll get there. We can, we just got to figure it out. So I can see a day where the molecules somehow can't get through the blood-brain barrier, and we can do all this without it affecting the cognition. What I will say is, on the few times that I've gone off the drops before surgery, I went off for a week because it can interfere with anesthesia, and there's some studies coming out of Colorado and other places that have a booming recreational market, and they're noticing that it can interfere with anesthesia. So I went off. I also went off the drops when we drove to Colorado for the summer for a few days. And as soon as I'm off the drops, I feel the clarity coming back. I feel my ability to focus coming back. I feel my ability to... So I feel like I'm still under there, and I'm not too worried that anything is really too permanent.
Yeah.
And I tend to take the biggest doses at night so I can sleep through all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I read, and you mentioned THCA, was, and again, as you said, we were so early in trying to understand what's going on here, but THCA could possibly have, some of the medical qualities of THC without necessarily the intoxicating qualities.
Sure, yeah. I think we have to think of cannabis as a giant basket of pharmacology. There are 550 compounds. And it appears like so many of them are biologically and pharmacologically active. So it's really complicated, and I understand most people don't have the science background to think of it that way. But we're doing a disservice by just saying CBD and THC, and it's such a complex plant. But we have to, patients who are in my position, we have to think about it that way and try to be more precise.
Yeah. And then, as you say, the further complicated layer is each human is individual, and your tumor and your growth in your body are going to be different to someone else who has it. So that's another layer of complexity to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people need to think about the mutations that are driving their cancers. Sort of the point of origin's a little bit irrelevant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And it's unfortunate that it's so complicated, because it's going to be years to tease this apart. I mean, if I was a graduate student right now, I would be getting myself trained up in cannabinoid pharmacology as fast as I could. And I think it's going to keep researchers busy for a decade.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. And have you found that the kind of community spirit that you referred to, and it also you must be connecting with people all over the world who are going through different types of cancer and sharing your learnings and stuff. How has that all been?
That's really good for me to help people. I'm so early in this that, I don't know if I'll figure this out, and to die before you're 50, it's just an awful thing to come to terms with. But if I can help and push this forward, that makes it a little bit more palatable. So I get messages probably once a week from a patient that wants help, and I try to help them the best I can. I hate being in this position. The fact that we're having to fight for the science of something that's so groundbreaking and saving people's lives is just pathetic. I mean, the mess that we're in around this plant is just so profoundly, I mean, the harm that's been done, it's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy.
Yeah. But I really look forward to the pandemic being over and when it's safe to travel, and I hope that I can go to conferences and help more patients. And I was really hoping that we would crack this open quickly, but I feel like it's going to still be a fight. So as long as I'm healthy, I feel like this is my calling and what I need to do with my time. So I can't wait to meet more patients and share my story and, try to jumpstart the science as best as I can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's incredibly brave and, sort of, I would say trailblazing, but, you've gone out there and you're really trying to learn more and also share that knowledge. And one of the ways that you have done that is by producing this documentary called Schedule 1. Would you mind telling the audience a bit more about that?
Sure. It was just at the time when I had this big 50% decrease in my tumor marker on only the cannabis. And I ran into a friend who's a filmmaker and told him what was happening and went to visit him. And I thought, it just popped in my head. I was like, my God, we should make a movie. And of course, I had seen Rick Simpson's film and I had seen Weed the People, but I just felt like I wanted to make something that would reach someone like my dad, who is a retired urologist and who was very skeptical. And I thought if we can make something that's shorter and try to pull more science into it and just get people to see this can work. Like I've read so many studies where they say the potential, we need more trials. And I thought it works. I mean, it's not easy, but it's like, here I am. I did it and I shrank my tumor on only cannabis. So I thought, let's make a short film that tries to reach the right kinds of people for free, tweeting it out to oncologists and at all the meetings and trying to get the people who can make the change to listen. And so Michael and I worked on that for a few months and got it done just before the pandemic. We had a showing for all my supporters and people who had donated to the Kickstarter and all of the wonderful growers who had helped me. And that was March 4th, I believe, down in Carpinteria. And then, of course, the pandemic got going. So we had hoped to make some edits to the film and take it on the film circuit road. So it showed at the very last weekend in Los Angeles before the pandemic lockdown. And we decided we shouldn't go, which was really heartbreaking when you put your blood, sweat, and tears into a project. And so I have no idea how many people saw it at the LA Film Festival. But apparently, it was there. It was on the roster. There might have only been 4 people in the audience. But I got the laurels I can put on the website. And so it's on YouTube. And I know that oncologists have watched it. And I know things are happening. But you just shouldn't have to fight for science like this. I mean, it's the lesson that people making policy, aren't paying attention to the science. And yeah, it's just so frustrating. So that's the film. And I hope that it's inspired people and that there's a future here for this. And we need to stop prohibiting this kind of research.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a great film and it's really heartwarming. And you speak to Dr. Mary in it and other people too. And it's a really valuable message that needs to be out there and understood. You referred to your father. How is the film being received amongst your family and your journey in general? How has that helped to transform their thoughts?
Yeah, at first people thought I was crazy and desperate, but I just sent my dad, PubMed papers. And when you see the science, it's, pretty clear that there's something to this. So, yeah, all my friends have been incredibly supportive. I think because we are in a very sciencey community. I mean, just pretty much all of our social circle as professors at UCSB, and yeah, they all think it's great. They're all everybody's like, good job, Michelle. And my husband, who's a dean at the university and has lots of publications, but he's said, maybe with a jealous tone in his mouth, what you've done is going to change the world more than my entire career of science, which isn't really true. But, I think we need to give credit to all of those lovely preclinical workers, researchers, and labs around the world who are pushing this forward and doing the hard work to make this happen. So they're the real heroes of the story. But so the reception of my family and friends was totally fine. No one ever pushed back because people know I've got my head screwed on right, and so they all trusted and believed me. But definitely the oncologists were all, well, my oncologist, she wrote my recommendation, which is what we call it instead of a prescription since it's federally illegal. But she wrote my recommendation for cannabis initially, and she's always been very supportive. Her standard line is, if you think it's helping, Michelle, and you feel okay, then I don't care where the cure comes from. But it definitely was stressful. We're talking about a substance that's federally illegal, and I understand if you've gone through a traditional medical education that it seems a little bit, crazy. My father's had a hard time sort of understanding there's an entire system in the body that he didn't learn about in medical school, and a system that's the foundation of managing all of the other systems and so critical. So I get it that it can be a hard sell. But I've had friends, physicians who've donated to the film. A woman that we hardly know, but she rented our house when we were on sabbatical, who's a OBGYN and specializes in high-risk pregnancies. She rented our home while we were on sabbatical, and she donated $1,000 to the film. And of course, she knew about my diagnosis when we were in Oxford, but she had, known about overabundance of the CB receptors in women's gynecological tissue. And she just, Michelle, good for you. This is amazing. And she gave this huge donation. So there have been physicians who are incredibly supportive, and we need them to stand up and say, this is real. And we need, I can understand if people don't want it recreationally legal. I happen to think it should be. But at the very least, we need to allow science. It's just madness that the science is so difficult to do.
Yeah. And actually, yeah. I probably should have asked this earlier, but the reason that you called the documentary Schedule 1 is because of the designation in the US. Would you mind elaborating on that?
Sure. I know in the UK you have a different classification, but in the US, Schedule 1 drugs are considered to have no medical benefit and to be highly addictive and high potential for abuse. And it is technically legal to do science on cannabis in the United States. It's just incredibly difficult. And that's changing, but it's huge regulations, paperwork, just onerous, ridiculous hoops to jump through. And so, that's part of the problem. And so many of the cannabis movies have these goofy names. And, this is serious. We're talking about people's lives. This is healthcare. I have a terminal disease, and I'm not going to call the movie something silly. And I thought that this is the stumbling block, is Schedule 1. So that's why we called the movie that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your story, which is so brave and really an inspiration to lots of people. And thank you for creating the documentary, which is no doubt going to be very useful for lots of people to kind of shine a light on this. And I'll be sharing the various links and all that stuff when we push the show out.
Great. One thing I'd like to say is, for cancer patients, if you have an amazing response to cannabis, try to get your physician to write a case report. We need, more of these stories in the literature. We're not going to change until we get it in the science. And so we need physicians to say, my patient had this incredible response. And if we get some of those in the literature, that really will help drive the change. And one of the other things that I've done to try to establish this as something that's real is I reached out to Dr. Piamelli at the University of Irvine and Marianne Liebert, who publishes the main cannabinoid journal, Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research. And they have started a new series called Patient Perspectives, where they will be documenting. And so my case will be the initial story in that publication. And that sort of tells what a ridiculous place we are. This isn't how science is supposed to work. But just having my story in a scientific journal like that, we need more of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yes. And I hope people do act on those words. Thank you so much, Michelle. And we all wish you the best with your continued fight. And we do hope that we get a chance to speak again about how things are progressing.
Yeah. I'm hopeful. I am very hopeful. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.